In today's video, we're going to go through a couple of tests to see if your TFL muscle is tight, and then 3 unique tensor fasciae latae stretches to loosen it up. Yo, what's up? It's Eric Wong here from Precision Movement, and today we're going to go through a couple of tests to see if your tensor fasciae latae muscle is tight, and also 3 unique exercises to stretch and to mobilize that guy out, to let it lengthen out. Okay, I use the term stretch loosely here. Okay, so first of all, if you've got pain in the tensor fasciae latae, you don't necessarily want to get into stretching right away. You want to make sure you understand what's causing the pain in the first place. Okay, what's the root cause of that pain? So if you've got pain in the tensor fasciae latae, first check out my video on tensor fasciae latae pain, which I'll link to right up here on YouTube here. Okay, because that is going to give you that understanding that you need to understand first before you get into exercises, stretches, or anything to do with getting rid of that pain for good. Okay, so now if you don't have pain, or if you know that you do need to stretch out the tensor fasciae latae, or if you feel like you've got to stretch out the tensor fasciae latae, let's first talk about a couple of indicators of tensor fasciae latae tightness. Okay, so the first indicator is pelvic position. Okay, so if you have an anterior pelvic tilt, so sticking out like that, is as if your pelvis is dropping water out the front of it. If your pelvis is a bowl, it's dropping water out the front. That's an anterior pelvic tilt. Then you might have tensor fasciae latae tightness. Okay. One way to test that is to go back to a wall and just stand with your heels against the wall, good posture. Stick a hand in between your low back and the wall. And if you can just kind of snugly fit your hand in there, that's a good neutral posture. If you've got a lot of space in between your hand and the wall, then likely have an anterior pelvic tilt. And then if it's kind of tight or you can't even fit your hand back there, that's a posterior pelvic tilt. Okay, so that's a quick test to see if you've got an anterior pelvic tilt. Now, that's for bilateral tightness of the TFL. So you've got tightness in both tensor fasciae latae muscles. Another way to test that with anterior pelvic tilt is you start with your feet about 2 inches from the wall, bring your feet right together, and then actively you're trying to posteriorly tilt your pelvis and flatten your lumbar spine against the wall. So with this, your head's got to touch, your thoracic spine's got to touch, and then you flatten out the lumbar spine. And if you can flatten the lumbar spine out against the wall with your feet together like this, you likely don't have tight TFL muscles. Okay? If they're painful or they're sore or they feel like they're tight, definitely check out that other video. Okay? If you cannot flatten your lumbar spine out, let's say you try it out, you can't flatten the spine out, and then you do it again, but this time go shoulder width with the feet. Same position, about 2 inches from the wall, head touching, shoulder blades touching, and then try to posterior pelvic tilt. And let's say you can flatten it out then. That's a really good indicator that you have TFL tightness, okay? Because when you adduct like so, that tightens up the TFL, and that prevents you from flattening the lumbar spine out because it'll prevent posterior pelvic tilt. But when you have your feet shoulder width apart, that loosens up the TFL so that it doesn't restrict your posterior pelvic tilt anymore. Okay? So that's a little test for bilateral tightness. Now, unilateral tightness, if you've got one tight muscle, you probably feel it, but what you'll notice if you look in a mirror is that one hip will be lower than the other. Okay, so if this is my pelvis, you'll be tilted like that. On the tight side will be over here. Okay, the tight hip will be dropped. So that's if you have unilateral tightness. So just look in the mirror, check it out, and see if you've got a pelvic drop on one side. If so, you've likely got a tight TFL on that side. Okay, so now that we've gone through the tests, let's go through a few different techniques. The first is a really basic static stretch. Now, the most common static stretch I see is people on the wall, they'll cross their foot over top. So I'm stretching this TFL here, and then they'll throw their body over to the side like this. Okay, now this is okay, but this is going to hit likely more glute medius, and it's going to hit more the lateral torso musculature. Okay, so I've come up with a better static stretch for TFL tightness. So what you want to do is we're basically doing the opposite motions of the TFL. We're getting into the opposite position. So the TFL does hip flexion, it does abduction, and it does hip internal rotation. Okay, so we're going to go into hip extension. So let's say I'm stretching this TFL right here. I'm going to go into hip extension. I'm going to go into external rotation of the hip, and then I'm going to go into adduction. Okay, and from here, I just drive my hip forward, and I try to keep my pelvis square. And this is how we're going to stretch out the TFL a little bit better. Okay? So we're going into external rotation. Okay? Extension, so we step back, and then adduction of the hip. And then from there, I just drive the hips forward, keeping my pelvis square. The pelvis will want to open up like this. That's not going to work. We've got to keep the pelvis rotated even in this way a little bit more to stretch out that TFL. Okay? So that's a simple static stretch for the TFL. The next technique is just like the test that I showed you for anterior pelvic tilt. So what you're going to do is you're going to do the same thing, but you're going to find where's that level where I cannot flatten my lumbar spine against the wall. So if you tested positive, it was feet together, but there's going to be a distance between your feet where it's like, oh, okay, 6 inches is where I cannot flatten out against the wall. From there, you want to go in about 1 inch and then work the same movement, posterior pelvic tilt. So now it's an active stretch. We're actively stretching the TFL by contracting the abdominals and the glutes to get into posterior tilt. Okay, knees stay straight, feet are pointing straight ahead, and we hold it for 30 seconds. Do this for 5 repetitions, and this is, as opposed to stretching the muscle statically like in the first stretch, now we're stretching it through reciprocal inhibition and relaxation neuromuscularly. Okay? So 30 seconds, you can do 5 repetitions. Okay? Every time you do this, you might find, oh, I can get a little bit closer, get a little bit closer. Once your feet are able to get right close together, then you know, okay, you've restored length. So I really like that stretch because it's active, first of all, and it's progressive. You can see your progress as your feet get closer, and you can still maintain the lumbar spine. You see your progress as you go. So it's motivating that way. All right? Finally, last stretch. It's the 4-point active TFL stretch. So we're getting into the 4-point position here. Now I'm going to aim for this TFL. We're going to do the same thing as we did for the static stretch, but now we're going to do it actively. So get a nice stable position, turn the elbows down, neutral spine, chin is tucked, okay? Then we're going to go into hip extension, external rotation, and adduction, okay? Make sure you're not moving from the spine, just from the hip. So you're not going to get the leg way up here because that's all lumbar spine. We're just going to go extension, external rotation, adduction. Pure hip movement, keep the abdominals nice and tight, keep the pelvis square to the floor, and hold it. Okay, holds for 5 to 10 seconds, 3 to 6 reps, and you're good to go. And definitely do both sides just to keep that strength balance from left to right. Okay, so that technique I like because it's, again, it's an active technique, working the muscles that will lengthen that TFL through their own strength, as opposed to through gravity, which we're doing in this one. Okay, I'm just driving gravity and basically pulling the muscle apart. This way, it's my muscles are activating, and you get that neuromuscular reciprocal inhibition working with you for you as well. Okay, so there you have 3 unique stretches for the Tensor Fasciae Latae. Remember, if you've got pain, you've got to check out the other video and article that I've got for you. So click through to that. I'll link to it at the end of this video. Otherwise, if you just got a tight TFL, use these stretches and it'll be loosened up in no time.